Good morning. When I started my Nuffield journey, I intended to work out from other countries what we could do to develop a vibrant community of entrepreneurs bringing new agricultural technologies to market here in the UK. Before I get into how that journey unfolded, I should just explain a couple of things. As a 2020 scholar, a lot of my experience looked like this. But the upside of that, apart from being low carbon, is that I was able to visit a lot more countries than I would have been able to in person. I should also clarify why I think AgTech is important, although Ed's done an excellent job of covering that for me. There are at least three major issues that agriculture faces. Firstly, a shortage of farm labour. Secondly, frequently a shortage of farm profitability. And thirdly, the very significant impact that agriculture has on the environment. And why do I think entrepreneurship is important in this picture? Well, because entrepreneurs are able to exploit niches and trends that incumbents may not be able to. They're also typically much more open to change, and they very often come from other sectors and bring new skills into the industry. So I set about exploring how could we learn from other countries to create a vibrant community here. But I quite rapidly discovered that I was asking the wrong questions. Because what I noticed was a pattern of interactions. And I thought, if I don't investigate that pattern of interactions, well, I might come up with the wrong answers. And the pattern is something that I came to call the chain of extraction, which is a tendency in interactions for resources to move more in one direction than they do in the other. And the consequence of that is that over time, it depletes the ability of one party to continue to generate value for subsequent parties. Now that's a bit theoretical, so I'll give you some examples to put some flesh on the bones. But in the context of agricultural technology entrepreneurship, what that looks like is that investors are exploiting from entrepreneurs are exploiting from farmers and growers are exploiting from the environment. So starting with investors. Investing in startups is risky. It's always going to be risky. But what we tend to hear about is the successes, the Steve Jobs, the Mark Zuckerbergs. But the reality for most entrepreneurs looks more like this. I spoke to a professor at Copenhagen Business School who described to me some statistics that really shocked me. On average, entrepreneurs earn 20% over their lifetime than wage earners. And that penalty exists even if they stop running their own venture and go back into the workforce. They're more likely to suffer relationship breakdowns, and they're more likely to suffer from mental health issues and from addiction issues. In one study, up to 3/4 of entrepreneurs were struggling with one or both of those. And what's different, the reason there's extraction, is that the investor can spread their risk across a portfolio of investments, whereas the entrepreneur can't. And typically, the investor is compensated through their management fees, whereas the entrepreneur is not only paying financially, but through their health and their relationships, etc. This is a problem, because if entrepreneurship looks like this, why would our best and brightest want to go down the route of commercializing their ideas and bringing those new technologies to market? Entrepreneurs themselves are extracting from farmers and growers. An example here on the right is Andrew Todd, a 2020 scholar from Australia. Now, he wanted to be part of the future, so he agreed to be involved in a trial of a new technology called Seed Terminator. And this device attaches to the back of the combine, it separates out weed seeds and mechanically destroys them so they don't go back into the seed bed. The idea being less herbicide, less time and money, and overall better for the farmer, better for the environment. But you can't just develop that in a lab and launch it, you have to trial it. So Andrew invested 90,000 Australian dollars in order to have this piece of kit, and for a small share of the company, the idea being it would align interests between the entrepreneur and the farmer. But the kit didn't work as it should have done. It was just a commercial prototype. And it slowed his harvest so much that after 3 weeks, when there was a high wind event, he lost between $300,000 and $400,000 of his crop because it just fell to the ground. So the extraction that happens there is expertise, it's time, and it's an asymmetry of risk. But again, we can't not do trials. We have to try new technologies. And lastly, the extraction from the environment. I think most people in this room recognize what an issue this is. I spoke to people from the World Wildlife Fund and also from the FAO about the statistics, and I was shocked. 70% of freshwater usage goes into agriculture. 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system. There's 1.7 million square miles of ocean dead zone due to agrochemicals and fish farming. But with 8 billion people on the planet, we can't stop farming. We've got to find a better way of doing it. And that's why we hope that technologies will matter. But the problem is, if our system is set up to extract all the way along, how likely is it that we will come up with these new technologies that make a meaningful difference? An analogy came to me, actually at the conference last year, which is that the way we have our investment system set up bears some resemblance to this. Traditionally in agriculture, what we've done is focus on maximizing yields by simplifying down to a very small number of species, using very intensive inputs, and trying to eliminate as much other complexity as possible. And that's begun the price of that has begun to become very clear in environmental impact and also in social impact on agricultural communities. Over the last 20 years, we've started to see the emergence of regenerative agriculture, which has a very different philosophy. It aims to focus on the underlying source of fertility, to give back as well as to take out, and to live with the complexity of species diversity. And so I started to think, well, in entrepreneurship, what we tend to do is to focus on a very small number of ventures or a very small number of technologies, often those that are trendy. And we do that with very heavy financial inputs, but not and trying to eliminate as much other complexity as possible, but not recognizing that there are all these collateral impacts that I mentioned earlier. So, the question that came to me was, how do we do it differently? And my conclusions are that we need to think differently. This is for agriculture as a whole. We're very good at what's called reductionist thinking, simplifying things down. We all learn that at school or, as we go through our careers. But how do we get better at systems thinking, understanding second and third order implications and how things interact? And how do we get better at collaboration? That means building what one person called collaborative advantage instead of simply competitive advantage. And secondly, for agricultural technology investment and entrepreneurship, we need to do a lot more diversification over what ideas we back, how we back them, and how those investments are made. Now, this sounds a bit naive, but I've found some really good examples as part of my study. This is AgLaunch. It's an agricultural technology business accelerator based in Memphis, Tennessee. They put farmers at the heart of the decision-making. Farmers select which ventures they want to trial. Farmers are involved in setting up those trials, and importantly, their non-monetary contributions are valued alongside the monetary contributions. And the benefits are that the ventures are better trialed and de-risked, the investors have a lower risk investment, and the community benefits from the opportunity to diversify those farming businesses and from a financial upside if and when and as these ventures are successful. Secondly, an example of a charity, the Nature Conservancy, which is making direct venture capital investments in startups that they think are going to move the needle on the issue of soil health. That not only puts capital into businesses that can make a real difference for the environment, it also changes the dialogue at the board table. Thirdly, Te Hono in New Zealand. This organisation isn't aimed at entrepreneurs, but it's aimed at the primary industry sector, helping leaders in that industry through what they call their boot camp to build the trust and the risk sharing and the holistic mindset, that systems thinking capability, to find different ways to compete. So to move away from the volume-based system and the commodity-based system to a more value-added, and in fact what they call the values-based system. And lastly, the focus on the investment mechanisms. Now this in itself is a long topic, so just in brief, an example here, this lady, Orny Patton-Power, is an academic who spent the last 10 years researching, practicing, and communicating alternative mechanisms of investing in startups so that the finance is tailored to the needs of the business, not the business tailoring to the needs of the finance. And being able to demonstrate that by doing this, not only can you get good financial returns, but you can also have much greater impact on the non-financial consequences of a business. My very far-sighted sponsors, the Elizabeth Creek Charitable Trust, were kind enough to support me because of being stuck to my desk, being able to turn my research and the interviews that I made into a podcast, which goes into a lot more detail, particularly around the finance, if that's your thing. But I want to now just wrap up by saying thank you to everybody who made this possible. In particular, Nuffield International and Jodie, without whom I probably wouldn't be here. Several other people in this room who were extremely supportive, and not to mention my family and my team who made it possible for me to take a step back and do this work, which has radically changed my perspective on the issues that we need to tackle in order to bring technology to market and the opportunity to do so. Thank you.